public.
Well, Peter, you say there are pools out, and that's correct. These pools are under military supervision. They have gone where the military has permitted them to go and no place else. The military has said what units the pools can visit and what units the pools may not visit. Now, the pool reports will come back here to Dhahran at some point. How long it takes them to get here will depend on military transportation. The pool video will come back here also. It will be reviewed for security purposes. The pool reports will be looked at for the same reason, and then they will be disseminated to news organizations. And Peter, if I may, I think there's not a reporter or photographer over here who wants to release any information that would give aid and comfort to the enemy. You and I were talking earlier about where the 7th Corps was, and I said I couldn't tell you. I know where the 7th Corps is. For that matter, I'm sure the Iraqis know, but on the chance that they don't, I'm not going to give that information. On the other hand, we'd like to see other things and just what the military wants to show us. Peter?
Okay, Sam, thanks very much. Makes people hot under the collar for a variety of different reasons. We'll leave it there for now. We'll be back to talk about the military campaign, not the press campaign.
See and hear and what's going on there.
Well, Dan, it's first light here, and this is one of the areas where oil wells have been burning, so there's a great deal of oily gray in the sky. We are, as you said, located up just over a mile from the border between Saudi Arabia and Kuwait in eastern Saudi Arabia. Until yesterday morning, the front line was a quarter-mile from our position. We could see it. It was a line of light artillery vehicles. Yesterday at 8 o'clock in the morning, a column of tanks moved in from the west, and something quite unusual happened. Usually the bombardment here in the time we've been here for the past 4 or 5 days has taken place mostly at night. At 9 o'clock yesterday morning, there was bombardment from every direction, from a warship, presumably the Wisconsin or the Missouri out in the Gulf, from artillery and overhead from bombers. And under that cover, the tanks that had arrived from the west moved up along the sand wall, the 12-foot sand wall that's a mile from us along the border, and moved into position. So the front moved up. We, at first light this morning, can't see them. We don't know if they're still there. We don't know if they've moved over the night. But one thing we can tell you is that the bombardment last night, and it continues to this moment, has been exceedingly heavy, heavier than anything we've heard. We were watching it last night. Because of the oil in the sky, we couldn't see the flashes. We could hear the booms. The ground rumbles every time a bomb falls in Kuwait a mile from us, or one of the warships fires its big 16-inch guns. And we could literally hear the shells from the Gulf, from the warship, whichever is the Wisconsin or the Missouri, going overhead. So exceedingly heavy bombardment here that continues to this moment.
Bob McEwen, we believe yours to be the very first report, certainly the first independent report from the battlefront itself. As dawn breaks, what are you seeing and hearing, and have you talked to troops, talked to Marines up there? What's their mood? What's their morale?
We're behind the Allied lines. Most of the troops in this area are Saudi infantry and artillery and armored vehicles run by the Qataris. To be very honest, we haven't approached them because we don't want them to know that we are here. But when certainly last night got the sense that something was happening, before the bombardment began, which was 10 o'clock our time, 2 p.m. Eastern, it was very, very quiet. On previous nights, you could hear voices, you could hear yelling, you could hear people off in the distance. There was none of that last night. It was eerily quiet. Earlier in the day, we had heard the discharge of machine gun fire. We presume it was just the Saudi army testing their equipment. So there was an eerie calm last night, followed by the heaviest bombardment that we've seen up here for 4 or 5 days. Let me just give you a sense of what we have seen in this area, and I don't think there are any military secrets here. This is what everyone knew existed up here. We've driven west along the front line, literally in front of the artillery. And it's the impossibly flat Saudi plain here. It's desert, and it just goes on forever. And as you looked out across it, you saw what appeared to be gopher hills. What they were, as you got closer, were sand walls, and behind each of them would be a light artillery piece, a heavy gun, or a tank. We presume, we didn't venture out there yesterday for fear of being detected, but we presume that a lot of that has moved up towards the border. We saw a lot of movement on the roads yesterday.
Bob, of course, the guns being silent for a period, that's classic when you're going to launch a big offensive. Then the signal is given for the terrific barrage, and so it played itself out just by the book. Bob, is there any indication there as to whether the Iraqis are still in their first line of defense or whether they have moved back to their second line of defense as the Allies begin to bombardment and indeed move across the border?
Well, all we have on that is a few discussions we've had with various individuals in this area. And again, they've had to be couched in the most tactful way. But the original expectation up to a couple of days ago was that the initial Iraqi line, and we are a mile from the border where I'm speaking to you now, the Iraqi line was about 8 kilometers or 5 miles behind that. And it was presumed that from the border back to that Iraqi position, 5 miles farther back, there was a classic defensive system that the Iraqis have set up. The minefields, the trenches, perhaps filled with oil to capture tanks, and behind that, the troops who have had, at this point, more than 6 months to dig in. There's no way of knowing that. Frankly, we can see into Kuwait on a night, on a good day, before the oil well started to burn 2 days ago. We could see into Kuwait. We still couldn't detect that, so they're farther back than our line of sight. They're not very far away, and the ground here rumbles. Everything shakes when a bomb hits over there, so we're that close. We have no way of knowing whether they're still at that 5-mile point or whether they've moved even farther back.
As part of our CBS News Live coverage of the beginning of the ground war offensive, we're talking to Bob McEwen, CBS News reporter who's 1 mile from the Kuwaiti border. Bob, any indication of how far up you think the Allies are now?
Well, all we know is that when the sun went down yesterday, we could see the tanks along the sand wall a mile from us. Now, these are what they call the berms that they've built all the way along the border. What you would see from my position, if it were that kind of day again, and with the oil in the air is not likely to be today, you see a Saudi border tower. You see the first village across the border in Kuwait, the border crossing, and between that, this 12-foot wall, yesterday lined with, I presume, Saudi and Qatari tanks. I don't know if they're still there, but the bombardment's been ferocious overnight, and I presume that they haven't ventured too far into it, so I presume they are still there, just waiting for this bombardment to take its toll, and then to make their move.
And ground to air, that is to air to ground attacks from, have you seen much air attack through that smoke from the burning oil wells?
Well, we hear the planes overhead all the time, and it's just impossible to see anything. It's like an oily tarpaulin hanging over our heads here, but you can certainly hear them. Some of the other sounds you do hear, the spotter plane, which is not very high tech, and which you can distinguish. It sounds almost like a Cessna overhead. And before the warships fire, what you hear is what they call the drone, and it is an automatic 12-foot plane, essentially, which goes out and takes surveillance photographs of the Iraqi positions and sends them back to either the Missouri or the Wisconsin, whichever has been firing recently. And that is aptly named.
If I may,
it's called the drone, and it drones. So those are some of the sounds we've been hearing. The spotter planes, the bombers high overhead, the drone coming out from the warships, and this constant rumble beneath our feet. I mean, literally, I am vibrating as I speak to you as the bombs go off a mile or 5 miles or 10 miles into Kuwait.
Bob McEwen, we're going to sign off now. For one thing, we'd like for you to be able to get back to us with this first-hand reporting from the front. You're 1 mile from the Kuwaiti border. We want to sign off now. Get back in touch with us later. There's some concern about detection, if you understand what I mean. So we hope to be talking to you later. Dug in Iraqi forces in Kuwait. There are probes going on there, some thrusts there, but the main movement is to be a sweeping, flanking movement through southern Iraq. And David Martin reports that main force has already begun to move. Let's check in at our listening post in Amman, Jordan, with CBS News correspondent Doug Donnell. Doug?
Dan, that news blackout isn't coming only from the Pentagon. Radio Baghdad this morning has yet to give any word of a change in the battle at the beginning of the ground offensive. Most Iraqis, if they're listening to it, are not aware. They're on Radio Baghdad simply reciting verses from the Quran, interspersed with some martial music. Earlier, however, Radio Baghdad did go on the air with a statement from the ruling Revolutionary Command Council. It was a response, the first response to the American ultimatum. It came after the deadline had already passed, and it said basically that Iraq would not heed the American deadline. That statement also said that the United States is, quote, out to complete the crime of destroying and annihilating Iraq. It also reminded all Iraqis, and especially Iraqi troops, that they were fighting to defend their homeland. Just a few moments ago here in Amman, we've spoken with a Jordanian official who says privately that the Jordanians and himself are angry and disappointed more than anything else that the ground war has begun. And he said that the ultimatum that was issued by the president was not followed by any real serious diplomacy. He said Jordan will continue to seek a peaceful solution, but that the forum for that should be the Security Council. Dan?
Noting, Doug, that Jordan has been perhaps the best ally, certainly one of the most vocal allies of Saddam Hussein. King Hussein in Jordan trying to keep a delicate balance, but leaning very far towards Saddam Hussein. Our CBS News coverage of the beginning of the ground war offensive, live from Saudi Arabia.
And to say, put it mildly, it slows you down, it inhibits your visibility, and it makes it difficult to operate your weapons.
I was taking note of some dispatches from Saudi Arabia early in the battle near the Qadir oil field. Apparently, Allied shelling hit some stock of chemical weapons had been in the ground, and a small portion had been released and detected. What happens if the Allied artillery shells or shells of any kind hit chemical stocks on the battlefield?
Well, most of the time, what will happen is you'll get a highly localized spill. We call it gas. It really isn't gas, it's a vapor. It is generally much heavier than air. So once it explodes, it's dispersed into the air, but unless there's a high wind, it tends to fall relatively quickly and over the immediate area where the explosion takes place. Now, unfortunately, Peter, that isn't always true. There are what we call skip effects, where if there is a high wind or an oddity of wind, it can be picked up and deposited in unpredictable areas a substantial distance away.
Okay, Tony, thank you very much. Just one of the many problems that a vast number of American and other Allied soldiers face this morning, just before 7 o'clock in the morning now in the Middle East, as the land campaign makes its way into Kuwait and into Iraq.
Tell me your own reaction to the news that the ground war has started.
You know, I hear about the ground war is going to start today at 2 o'clock at night, and I was very happy that the ground war is going to start today because, as you know, there is more than 250,000 Kuwaitis inside of Kuwait City. They are been waiting for this ground war more than 7 months, and all the Kuwaitis out of the country are waiting for this ground war. And this is the way to eject Saddam Hussein from Kuwait.
Captain El-Sabah, we wish you the very best, and we know that you're very eager to have the liberation of your country occur very soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And NBC's John Cochran now is at the White House with some late news for us. John?
Well, it turns out, Tom, that back on February 9th and 10th, when Secretary of Defense Dick Cheney and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Colin Powell, were in Saudi Arabia, they told General Schwarzkopf at that time to come up with a window, a time to launch the ground war. On February 11th, Schwarzkopf said the best time, 8 p.m. local time, that is to say the time where you are, on February 23rd, which of course comes out to be noon today. This was, in other words, 2 weeks ago the decision was made. President Bush gave the go-ahead at that time unless General Schwarzkopf was to be stopped in the interim. And what happened was on Thursday, this last Thursday, the president decided to make this one last ultimatum, giving Saddam Hussein one last chance to withdraw. Once that window of opportunity passed, which is to say noon today, Schwarzkopf was free to make his move. We had not known this, needless to say. This had nothing to do with the Soviet initiative. This date of noon today, Tom, many people thought this was a time that was suddenly fixed by the president because Saddam Hussein had accepted the Soviet initiative. Not true. Back on February 11th, President Bush gave a tentative go-ahead to launch the ground offensive starting at noon today, New York, Washington time, 8 p.m. where you are. Tom?
So it seems clear from that, John, that the president was determined to do what he could to destroy the military machine that Saddam Hussein has built up in this part of the world over the past 15 years or so, because there was so much concern, not just on the part of the United States, but its Arab and European allies, that he would withdraw and keep his military power intact.
Absolutely. And, you know, I mentioned on Thursday the president decided to give Saddam Hussein one last chance to pull out. The president was urged at that time by particularly the Saudis, also the Kuwaitis, the Syrians, the French, and the British, and to not let much time pass after that noon deadline. Of course, noon, that's to say noon here in Washington, 8 o'clock where you are, deadline which has passed now some 11 hours. The president, although he was urged particularly by the Saudis, he was told by the Saudis, listen, you will lose your credibility in the Arab world if you don't move, if you let that deadline pass. So you'll lose a lot of credibility if you don't move. George Bush said, I know what you're talking about. In other words, you don't really have to tell me that, folks. Tom?
John Cochran, have you been able to pick up there around the edges or from the core of the White House operation what the president ultimately has in mind for Saddam Hussein and for Iraq itself? Obviously, he wants to do more than just expel the Iraqi forces from Kuwait.
Well, of course, but he has to be very careful about this because of Arab sensitivities and sensitivities in other world capitals. It is still regarded as conceivable that Saddam Hussein, a greatly weakened Saddam, could continue in power. That is now considered to be extremely unlikely. If he suffers the crushing military defeat, which is fully expected here at the White House, it is thought that Saddam will be tossed aside by his own people. There is still, as far as I know, no intent to march into Baghdad to put Saddam Hussein in irons, for example. The question of a war crimes trial, military and civilian lawyers in the United States government have been hard at work compiling information so far, some of which they have nailed down as hard evidence, some of which is not hard intelligence yet, but they are prepared for war crimes trial, possibly on the Nuremberg pattern after World War II. But then you get to the question of how do you get your hands on the man? And I've not heard anything like a raid on Baghdad, such as President Bush employed to get General Noriega in Panama. Tom?
Thank you, John Cochran. We'll ask you to stand by at the White House. We want to bring you up to date. The land war is underway. It has been underway for several hours now. We'll get very little information because there is great concern that Saddam Hussein would use whatever he could pick up to launch chemical warfare attacks against that enormous Allied invasion that is taking place now in Kuwait to drive Iraq back to its own borders. NBC News will have continuing coverage of America at war now on the ground. In some cities, however, you may be seeing your local...
So one critical question is, how long will Saddam Hussein allow these troops, which have for years functioned as his personal defense force, to suffer on the battlefield?
I don't believe that Saddam Hussein intends his guards to fight to the death. He needs them for a regime maintenance role after the first stage of the war, the Battle of Kuwait.
They are the people who protect Saddam's regime. And if he wants to survive after this war is over at all, he's got to have somebody around him. And that's got to be the Republican Guard. So at a certain point, they will want to pull back, and he will want to pull them back.
Indeed, if the Republican Guards do escape total destruction, it could make it easier for Saddam Hussein to survive politically. By the same token, though, if the Guards are badly damaged, the Iraqi leader will have lost a force on which he has relied to maintain his hold on power. Mike Chenoy, CNN, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia.
CNN senior White House correspondent Charles Bierbauer has been standing by at the White House all day. Charles.
Susan, President Bush knew when he left the White House yesterday afternoon on his helicopter flying up to Camp David, that he would indeed be coming back this evening to announce to the nation and to the world that the ground offensive in the war against Iraq had indeed started this evening. In fact, according to spokesman Marlin Fitzwater, the president decided shortly before getting aboard the helicopter that he would be back this evening. The point is that all of this has been in preparation for a long period of time, really months. There are several key dates, of course, that have been passed as the situation, the Persian Gulf crisis, moved to a war, moved now to an all-out land and air war. Several of those worth noting. Of course, on January 15th was the date of expiry for the United Nations resolutions. That was the day that President Bush signed the National Security Directive, which authorized the offensive against Iraq. And of course, as we know, it was the next day, January 16th, that the air war started. From the beginning, the plan was to let the air war last as long as possible, do as much effective damage as possible to Iraq's troops. A detailed plan for the land war was drawn up by General Schwarzkopf, who's the U.S. commander in the field over in Saudi Arabia. And it was when General Colin Powell, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the Secretary of Defense went over to Saudi Arabia in the beginning of February to make the assessment as to when and how the ground war could be carried out. And they brought a report back to President Bush just about 2 weeks ago that Secretary Cheney, General Powell met with the president. The decision was made at about that time, it would have been on February 11th, for General Schwarzkopf to draw up a window of opportunity for this ground war. And indeed, it was decided fairly early on by General Schwarzkopf that the ground war would start on February 23rd at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. In fact, all the diplomatic maneuvering of the past week was almost a peripheral element, with the date having been set. It was only the last-minute decision by the president, a decision made Thursday evening, and in fact, General Colin Powell's suggestion that a deadline be enunciated. The president did that in the Rose Garden.
Time to have it drag on and not go well. NBC's Fred Francis is at the Pentagon now. He's got an update for us on the success of the operation so far. Fred?
Tom, a senior military official told me just moments ago that this is, quote, going extraordinarily well, better than we had planned. And this is someone who has been very straight with me over the years. I believe what he told me. This is an official who gave me some sense of the operation a few days ago, that U.S. tanks and troops would streak across the desert at extraordinary speed to get into some places in southern Iraq. And let me tell you how they achieved surprise this evening, Tom. They achieved tactical surprise in much the same way, according to this official, that they did in January 16th. And that is, they, for the last week, I am told, well, let's go back to January 16th. For a week leading up, or weeks leading up to the air war, this is it. They used these berms. They ran through the berms every day this week and gave the Iraqi soldiers the idea that this was just training. Day in, day out this week, those berms, which cover the entire area of the Kuwaiti border, U.S. tanks would fly through the berms and look like they were starting an attack. And in fact, it was just an exercise, and they did this all this week up and down the Kuwaiti-Iraqi border, and U.S. troops were flush on the border for the entire week. And the Iraqi observation post would see this and report back that M1 tanks like that one were going through, and the attack was beginning. Well, in fact, that's what they did on January 15th. They ran Saudi and American aircraft right up to the border for several weeks before the first air war began. And every week, every day, the radar would report the attack is coming. Well, that's how they achieved tactical surprise today. It was just another exercise with American and Allied tanks running through those berms. And of course, it worked from the early reports we have. Tom?
Thank you, Fred Francis. John Cochran at the White House. You have something else for us?
Tom, I'd like to go through what we call the tick-tock of what the president has been up to the last day or so, because some of it is instructive. There is some information here. We've talked about both sides using some disinformation in this war, and President Bush has apparently used a little on us in the last couple of days. When he left yesterday for Camp David, we were told by the White House he would be returning tomorrow afternoon, that is to say, Sunday afternoon. I'm now told that when he left here yesterday, he knew he'd be returning here in all likelihood tonight to make the brief address to the nation, which he did, because he knew that in all likelihood Saddam Hussein would turn down his ultimatum and that the ground war would be underway. Today, from Camp David, the president spoke to the following: the British Prime Minister, John Major, the Canadian Prime Minister, Brian Mulroney, Chancellor Kohl of West Germany, President Özal of Turkey, Prime Minister Kai-Fu of Japan, and the president, of course, was called by Gorbachev Gorbachev called him about 45 minutes before the ultimatum expired. Gorbachev asked the president to hold off for a day or two. I'm told that the president's answer went something like this. It wasn't a stick-it-in-your-ear type answer. It was much more diplomatic than that. The president simply told Gorbachev that the coalition was committed. And we now know that in his own mind, George Bush was committed back on February 11th, almost 2 weeks ago, to this noon, that is to say noon East Coast time, period after which General Schwarzkopf would be free to launch the attack. Marlin Fitzwater, the president's press secretary, said he wasn't sure whether or not Gorbachev knew about this noon deadline. I'm told by another official that Gorbachev did not know. So that when Gorbachev was speaking to the president, he wasn't clear that Gorbachev didn't really realize how close that deadline was, less than an hour away. This evening, the president called all 4 living former presidents, informed them that the ground operation was underway, and then tonight, starting about 2 hours, 15 minutes ago, he started calling the congressional leadership. Tom?
Thank you very much on what the land war would look like once it began. And so here now is Arthur's version of the land war.
They are the battleships of this desert war, but in a full-scale armored assault. Tanks usually advance midway through the operation. Artillery kicks off the attack, smashing down enemy positions, trying to force opposing gunners and infantrymen to go underground. Then, helicopters rush forward. Airborne troops are dropped on and behind enemy lines. Their mission? Knock out the small, mobile, anti-tank rocket crews and other threats to their own armored force. As troop-carrying armored vehicles move to guard the flanks, engineering units must clear minefields and other obstacles. Only then does the main tank force burst through, with ground attack aircraft riding shotgun in the sky. In taking on Saddam Hussein's army, the big challenge for U.S. and Allied forces will be overcoming complex and deadly defense works. The Iran-Iraq War was a proving ground for Iraqi techniques of stalling armies rushing their lines and bleeding them, forcing a retreat. The task of U.S. and British engineers will be crucial. These operations are difficult enough in the best conditions. Clearing attack paths while under Iraqi rocket and shell fire could prove costly in lives and equipment. In the end, men's nerves, their determination, will be the deciding factors. As one tank commander said in World War II, the armor can carry you only so far. Your soldiers must have the light of battle in their eyes. Arthur Kent, NBC News, in northeastern Saudi Arabia.
And Arthur Kent is back up there on the front lines, probably well inside Kuwait at this hour as a pool correspondent, one of the network pool correspondents assigned to a combat unit that probably, if not yet, if it has not moved across, it will be doing so very shortly. By the way, to give you some sense of just how tightly the information will be held by the United States military, we're told here by the Joint Information Bureau, shorthand is called JIB, all pool pictures will go to Riyadh and be fed bit by bit to New York. It has been coming in here to Dhahran because, frankly, this is where the networks all have their very best facilities, and we're much better equipped to handle it here than we are in Riyadh. But now they're going to send it to Riyadh. That means it will slow up the flow of pictures that are available to you about the conduct of this war so far, and there are more military sensors available in Riyadh as well. So it will be put through a very long military pipeline and a very narrow one at that. We are still now in the process of discussing this with the United States military. No one at the network level or at the newspaper level wants to put any American troops in jeopardy, but once those pictures get back here, it is of action that has already occurred, and it is the kind of information that we know that you are eager to see, as we are eager to bring it to you as swiftly as we possibly can. We'll try to work that out. And in Washington at the moment is Senator, what you have as a pilot,
well,
that's going on beneath you?
It will be a chaotic battlefield, and particularly where people are moving in and a lot of equipment is flushing out of their protected positions and getting out on the road. I'll tell you, one of the main things a pilot in the Marine Corps fears in a situation like that is dropping on friendlies, is hitting your own people, and you just take every possible precaution you can to absolutely, positively identify a target before you take a crack at it.
8 weeks from now, in late April, we begin getting into the hot period over there, Tom, where it becomes almost impossible to fight and to have people out in those desert conditions with temperatures of 115 or 20 degrees and with carrying combat gear up and down sand dunes or whatever. And that may have been a factor in why we had to start this thing right now. Otherwise, we get into a period of almost having to wait until next fall, till October, and then the question would be as to whether you could maintain 500,000 plus troops over there for that length of time. Some of them will have been over there by that time well over a year,
You'd have to set up a rotation system, but we do not have in place.
Everybody is continuing to follow the events, particularly in the earlier hours across the country in the Central Time Zone and on the West Coast. And again, as we've been following the military information, such as it is that we're receiving in terms of the ground offensive and the political and diplomatic maneuvering, from time to time we are pausing to find out what's happening on the home front, literally in homes with those families, those people who have loved ones, relatives, husbands, perhaps even wives over there serving in the war zone. Kenley Jones was with us earlier this evening from Hinesville, Georgia, the home of Fort Stewart, talking to one such person, and he's with us again this evening. Kenley?
Eric, once again, we're talking with Patty Keenahan, whose husband, Major Douglas Keenahan, is a signal officer with the 24th Infantry Division. Patty, you were saying earlier, talking about the mixed emotions you have about this decision tonight.
Right.
Has that been a problem all along?
No, pretty much I've felt that I've stayed the course with the president and most of my friends. It hasn't been too much of an emotional roller coaster except for the last few weeks.
What about these diplomatic moves recently? Did you ever have any realistic hope that those might succeed?
I did, but at the same time, I felt that he had to offer us more for them to be viable.
From what we hear from Fred Francis tonight, the operation seems to be going quite well. Are you encouraged? Obviously, I'm sure you're encouraged by that news, but do you think that the president has waited long enough and the military commanders have waited long enough so that this, the Iraqis are in such a weakened condition that this may not take as long as it would have?
Well, hopefully, I hope it's the right decision. I feel that they have waited long enough. It's been over 6 months, so it's good to get it over with now.
Okay, Patty Keenahan. Back to you, Gary.
Thank you, Kenley, for being with us this evening. And we're looking for information coming out of Baghdad. So far on the wires, we're not seeing all that much. It is morning, of course, over there. The Iraqi High Command, Saddam Hussein himself, must know exactly, or at least approximately, what is happening, that the ground war is on. He gets reports from his own military commanders in Kuwait. And he also, of course, can monitor international radio and television. But we'd say one thing this morning when radio came on in Baghdad, it broadcast about 30 minutes of recitations from the Quran. That's the way they started their broadcasting on this first day of the ground war. Back to you, Tom.
Thank you very much, Gary Gutley. It's worth pointing out as well that Baghdad took some very heavy hits.
Troops are moving into Kuwait, possibly into southern Iraq. President Bush cut short his weekend at Camp David to say Saddam Hussein is only redoubling his efforts to destroy Kuwait.
I have therefore directed General Norman Schwarzkopf, in conjunction with coalition forces, to use all forces available, including ground forces, to eject the Iraqi army from Kuwait.
Defense Secretary Cheney has clamped a lid on virtually all news of the war. He has suspended official briefings in Washington and Saudi Arabia until further notice. CBS News reporter Bob McEwen, just 1 mile from the Kuwaiti border, reported to us a short while ago that the huge guns of the battleships Missouri and Wisconsin are firing inland into Kuwait and causing literally the earth to shake. Let's check in with David Martin at the Pentagon. David?
Dan, the Pentagon press office tells me they're getting angry calls from viewers who can't understand why we're reporting what we're reporting when the Secretary of Defense has declared this news blackout. And I can only say to people that what we are reporting really, to the best of our knowledge, is not giving away any secrets. I have not been told by a single official here in the Pentagon that we are reporting too much and endangering the lives of troops. And believe me, they're not bashful about telling you that if they think you are. So just to say that to the people who are calling in here to the Pentagon press office. Also, during that brief press conference that Secretary Cheney gave, he said, I think, a very important thing that people need to keep reminding themselves of. He said it is not an objective of U.S. policy to change the government of Iraq. That means that we are not going to go beyond the liberation of Kuwait. If Saddam Hussein falls, so much the better as far as the U.S. government is concerned. But the U.S. government is not committed to going all the way to Baghdad and getting rid of Saddam Hussein. The U.S. government militarily is committed only
to getting all Iraqi soldiers out of Kuwait. There's a big difference there, and it means that the war is going to be much, much shorter when you have that limited objective. And of course, every day that you can shorten the war by, almost by definition, is going to shorten the number of casualties, and that, of course, is also a very important objective of this whole operation. The expulsion of Iraqi soldiers from Kuwait with minimum loss of American life. Thanks, David. As we've mentioned, the goal here now is to keep full pressure on, keep pressuring the Iraqis. Sports analogies do not hold up. In a basketball game, they have something called full court pressure. Baseline to baseline, all over the court pressing. This is war, not a game. But General Norman Schwarzkopf is trying to do exactly that on air, land, and sea. Unrelenting pressure in hopes of getting this over with as quickly as possible with the fewest numbers of casualties. Bill Plant is at the State Department. Bill?
Dan, the Secretary of State came back here to the State Department after he arrived with the President from Camp David, and he's been making a number of calls to the foreign ministers of other countries, courtesy calls to let them know what they no doubt by now already know, that this ground offensive has started. The Allies were informed. It's not clear whether all of them were informed in advance or not. We think probably not. The Secretary of State did talk again this evening to the Soviet Foreign Minister, Mr. Beshmertnik. We are told Beshmertnik expressed his disappointment that the Soviet peace plan was not able to work, but at the same time, we are told that Secretary Baker once again thanked the Soviet Union profusely for its help, for its intercession in this peace process. Now, it's true that there are people in this department who are very suspicious of the Soviet Union's motives, but the Secretary has gone out of his way to be nothing but complimentary to them in public. And I have to suspect, Dan, that one of the reasons is that the administration knows the United States will be criticized for choosing to go into battle when it could have had one part of what it wanted under some kind of circumstances if it had accepted Saddam Hussein's offer of withdrawal from Kuwait. And the U.S. will want the Soviet Union on its side when that battle comes. That certainly is one reason, in addition to wishing to maintain the best of relations with the Soviet Union. And then we should also tell you that the President's speech was sent out to embassies around the world, along with a note to ambassadors, instructing them to take any additional security precautions they may think necessary. This, of course, a reference to the terrorism which was expected when the war began in mid-January, which is still a very great concern, particularly in many other parts of the world. Dan?
Bill Plant. CBS News correspondent Eric Ingberg joins us again to profile one of the critical units involved in the war. Eric?
Well, Dan, I think that your sporting analogy that you used a minute ago about basketball holds true here, especially in warfare, in that you don't, when you are attacking an enemy, as the Americans are now doing across the borders, send everybody rushing forward in one phalanx. That generals use the term phasing, that campaigns have to be carefully phased with certain units rushing ahead and others staying behind. And it's always been believed by analysts of military affairs that when the U.S. does mount the land offensive, that one of the units that will likely move ahead of the others is the 24th Mechanized Division. Now, the 24th Mech, as it's called, is a unit that has tanks and also Bradley fighting vehicles and is designed to move very fast against enemy positions. We see them fighting last night in a battle against the Iraqis at night. This occurred across the border, and what particular border, whether Iraq or Kuwait, has been censored by the military. They don't want to give up the exact position of that unit. But in this particular operation, a tank infantry team was moved out to the sand berm, which is part of the dividing wall between Saudi Arabia and its northern neighbors. The troops there were able to use their night vision equipment and infrared equipment. They had sensing equipment that is actually thermal sensing equipment. That is, it can detect enemy soldiers by the heat that they give off. And these indications caused the elements of the 24th Mechanized to move ahead, cross that berm, and try to find these Iraqi patrols. On this particular mission, they didn't find any Iraqis, and they came back. But because of their ability to travel at very high rates of speed, and in fact, some military experts say that this unit could move 200 miles in a day if it had to. Dan, to give you some idea of how far that is for a mechanized unit in warfare, General Patton's longest reach across Germany during the closing days of World War II was 100 miles a day. This unit can go twice as far and maybe even farther than that if it's unopposed. So that's one of the reasons why it will likely have a key role in the assault.
Thanks, Eric. And our thoughts are certainly with General Frederick Franks, Jr., who commands the 7th Corps up there, of which the 24th Mechanized Infantry is a part. David Martin mentioned before that some people hearing Secretary Cheney talk about, well, we need a news blackout from the Defense Department, was making the point that the Defense Department is blacking out future information, that most of the information put out here has been widely talked about, widely published by the Army itself. Secondly, that while Saddam Hussein will be no doubt listening and watching carefully, he has the capability of receiving in one set of transmissions, not ours. Another network provides him, he gets their signal in. But even if he hears and sees what's happening here, part of what the U.S. military is doing, they want to unsettle him. They want him to hear how large the U.S. and Allied forces are and what the possibilities are. So when we talk about a great armored sweep through southern Iraq, there's no question, there's never been any secret. That's what General Schwarzkopf intended to do. The question for Saddam Hussein is, where is it going to go? When is it going to go? Is it going to be encirclement or just envelopment? Will it include airborne units, so-called vertical envelopment? All of those things keep him guessing, keep the pressure on him, and are indeed part of the psychological hope of cracking Saddam Hussein and his forces. For example, there's been a lot of talk about the 7th Corps, the 18th Corps, sweeping across the desert as far as the Euphrates River, cutting off the Republican Guard, perhaps even from retreating into Basra. All of those things present situations for Saddam Hussein in which he has to guess. So in that sense, the U.S. military doesn't mind that kind of information getting out at all. It's dawn here in Saudi Arabia, in Dhahran, and just north of here, back over there, the sky is dark from the oil fires of Kuwait. And as we've mentioned from time to time before, particularly in the daytime, you can even smell the heavy odor of the fuel. These are the fires inside Kuwait, taken by a brave CBS cameraman, David Green, along with some other cameramen. Night pictures, you can see more than 200 Kuwaiti oil wells and other installations burning. We mentioned once before that at the end of World War II, Adolf Hitler in his bunker kept asking his generals in Paris, is Paris burning? When Saddam Hussein asked, is Kuwait burning? The answer is yes. The German generals refused to put the torch to Paris, of course, during World War II. But those many fires are causing here 70, 75 miles below that. We not only can see the sky darken and see some of the smoke back there, but also can smell.
It's very early in the morning here. Most people here in Britain and across Europe are asleep now and probably don't even know that the ground war has begun. But the French and the British governments have issued strong statements of support. The statements were released to coincide with President Bush's statement in Washington. The one from the British Prime Minister's office says a massive ground attack has begun to drive Iraq out of Kuwait and secure the full implementation of UN resolutions. It goes on to say that British forces will play a full part in this operation, and we intend to achieve our objective as swiftly and with as few casualties as possible. There's another statement from the French presidential palace. This one is very brief. It says, the President of the Republic has given the order to engage French troops. That is the full statement, and as we know, French troops are indeed taking a full part in this offensive. There's one more statement that we have here, this one from Neil Kinnock, the leader of the Labour Party, the main opposition party here in Britain. And Mr. Kinnock says, now that the ground war has begun, let's hope that it gets over as soon as possible. Now, as I said, it is very early here, but we do expect to have more from the Allies in coming hours. Dan?
Thanks, Bill Whitaker in London. And indeed, British forces are right up jam on the front. Their artillery has been particularly effective over the last few days, and in the early hours of the ground war offensive, the famed British Desert Rats from General Montgomery's forces in World War II. That's part of their tradition and heritage. They're here. The French forces, including the French Foreign Legion, out far west of many of the other Allied forces in the Saudi Arabian desert. Also, the French have had their pilots with their Jaguar very close air-to-ground bombing. Perhaps the most, among the most dangerous bombing runs have been made by the French pilots in their Jaguars and the British pilots in their Tornadoes. Here are headlines of the hour. President Bush launches the ground war. U.S. Marines invade Kuwait in the first wave. Defense Secretary Cheney clamps on a news lid about future information. President Bush announced to the nation tonight that the liberation of Kuwait has entered what he called the final phase. The ground war, he said, is underway. In the initial action, U.S. Marines pushed as far as 18 miles into Kuwait. That was the last report where they were. Thousands of other Marines reportedly were in amphibious craft off the coast of Kuwait, and the Allies are said to have captured a small island that commands the sea approaches to Kuwait City. In Washington, Defense Secretary Cheney said there'll be no more regular military briefings for now, and news about troops and their movements will be sharply limited. He asked for understanding. That's all an effort to protect the troops. Now, another fighting vehicle besides the Army's M1 tank that will play a major role in this offensive is the Bradley fighting vehicle. Perhaps you heard it mentioned several times. Aaron Hayes takes a look at the Bradley in Knoxville, Tennessee.
Dan, we're inside the Bradley fighting vehicle right now. You know, there are two versions of it. This is the cavalry version, and with me right now to explain how it works is Sergeant Mike Caldwell, a commander on this vehicle, one who also trains men on this vehicle. Your primary role, I understand, in cavalry is not to attack, but is reconnaissance. Explain that to me, Sergeant.
Yes, our basic role is to seek, peek, and report where the enemy is, or seek, peek, and attack, depending on the situation. Basically, we would evade the enemy and just report where they're at, where the main body of the battle is going to be, routes that the enemy's taking, obstacles, and things like that.
In a word, you're scouts, I guess.
Right. Our basic mission is to scout for the main body.
What goes on in here during combat? You have 5 men in here.
Right. The two people that would sit here, they play a dual role. They're observers, looking out behind us, letting us know what's behind us and out to our side. Also to keep our weapon systems loaded, be it I need tow missiles or 25 millimeter ammo or coax ammo.
So it's pretty busy in here during combat, I guess.
Yes, it is.
Now, if they're getting out, they dismount from this door?
Yes, either
this
they
ramp?
can, depending on the situation, either they can exit through the ramp or out the back door here.
And I can see that the door is a pretty quick way out.
Yes,
the armor on the Bradley fighting vehicle, Sergeant, isn't quite as heavy or protective as the armor on the M1A1. I guess this is aluminum. It burns a little more easily. It certainly doesn't protect you against some artillery. Why the light armor?
Because of the mission. The tank has a much stronger mission compared to ours. A different vehicle for a different mission. I'm scouting where he's actual battle tank.
So you have to be light and quick, I guess.
Right. Lighter the faster that I can get in and get out.
Talk to me some about the weapons. I guess you have 3 weapon systems on this fighting vehicle. Even though your mission is to seek and peek and tell, you need to protect yourself. What's moving up right now, this is the tow missile launcher?
Right, this is our tow missile system. This is for tanks, for heavy armored vehicles. We also have the 25 millimeter chain gun, which is for our light skinned armored vehicles. And we also have the 240 Charlie coaxial machine gun, which is for infantry or wheeled vehicles.
So you mentioned to me earlier your main gun is the machine gun, and you hope you don't have to use your tow missile launcher.
Right. Basically because of the signature that it give off, giving away our position. But if we are in the position where we have to use it, then we will.
All right, and as you said earlier, you are the eyes and the ears of the Army on the front line. Sergeant Mike Caldwell, thanks so much. Dan, back to you.
Aaron Hayes, thank you very much. We were with the 24th Mechanized Infantry for a while out here in the desert just before the war started and rode in one of those Bradley vehicles. The troops like them, swear by them in that they know that this is a way to keep up with the tanks. What you frequently have is an infantry-supported tank column, and in the kind of relentless pressure attack, keep it moving, keep the heat on Saddam Hussein that General Schwarzkopf plans, the Bradley is indeed a key vehicle. Aaron Hayes talked about the upside of it, the advantages of it. Some of the disadvantages are it sets a little high on the terrain. Some of the U.S. military people don't like the fact that it sets so high on the terrain. And also at night, the Apache night-stalking, night-killing helicopters sometimes have difficulty picking out what are U.S. vehicles, such as the Bradley, and what are the Iraqi vehicles. That's some of the downside. Joining us now from San Juan, Puerto Rico, is former United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Dr. Kissinger, thanks for being with us. Help us put this ground war offensive beginning in some context, some perspective.
President Bush obviously made the judgment, with which I agree, that the offers of withdrawal of Saddam Hussein were so conditional that were he to accept them, the Iraqi dictator would be able to claim that he achieved something with the invasion of Kuwait that he would not have achieved otherwise. And he therefore concluded that there was no other route except to expel the Iraqi army from Kuwait. I think it was a courageous and correct decision.
Dr. Kissinger, what do you make of the diplomatic maneuvering by the Soviets? There are those who believe that Gorbachev has hurt himself very badly in Washington, and particularly with President Bush, by stepping in at the last minute and offering this peace plan. Your views on that?
Well, I think that that Gorbachev attempted to combine a number of incompatible objectives. He tried to maintain his relationship with the United States. He tried to appeal to the 60 million Muslims in his own country, and he tried to maintain at least some standing among the radical Arabs that used to be his allies. For a few days this week, I believe that he was being mischievous and made things very difficult. I think in the final phase, the behavior of the Soviet Union has been restrained, and I do not think that he has hurt the fundamental relationship with the United States.
Dr. Kissinger, now what President Bush calls the final phase has begun, the ground war. How does this end? How do we get what the military people call conflict resolution?
Well, it will, on the military side, we all have to hope and that it will end with the destruction of the Iraqi army in Kuwait. At this point, Saddam Hussein will have fought an 8-year war with Iran and gained nothing, losing hundreds of thousands of people, and he will have occupied Kuwait and have triggered a major clash with the United States, despite the fact that a whole series of very generous offers had been made to him by the United Nations coalitions before the war broke out. So one would think that in any rational country, he would be replaced. The United States has stated that it will have achieved its objective when Kuwait is liberated. We will have also destroyed the major part of the offensive capability of the Iraqi army, so that at that point we can, some sort of ceasefire should be arranged, and a negotiation for ending the war. And if there are any rational people left in Iraq, this is what should happen. If it doesn't happen, then I think we can still withdraw the major part of American ground forces and turn some of the peacekeeping over to the Arab element of the coalition forces.
Thank you very much, Dr. Kissinger. You'll understand when I say we need to...
El Wazra. This comes from Saudi information, which is on the radio.
Okay, thanks very much, Pierre. This business of taking Kuwait City is very important. 36 hours or however long it takes. One of the reasons President Bush says the Allied coalition was urged to move on now was because of the reporting, largely from the Kuwaiti resistance, hard to verify over the last several days, that the Iraqis had got particularly brutal with Kuwaiti citizens. There are reports that they had been rounded up and in some cases executed. A very quick comment from Judith Kipper in Washington tonight, our resident Middle East analyst, on how you think this is going to impact, Judith.
Well, Peter, I think that though we've been at war for several weeks, this is the day that most people in the Middle East will remember, and blood between Americans and Arabs is going to make us even closer, but also build up a lot of resentment. It changes the reality. It's a historic moment in our relations.
How well put, Judith. Thanks very much. Brief, but telling. Want to spend the last few minutes of this half hour with one of America's more thoughtful military political commentators, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Admiral William Crowe. Admiral Crowe, talk to us about the first day of a battle. Vast majority of American men going into combat have never had a day's experience.
Peter, we're committing an awful lot of young men tonight and tomorrow for their first time baptism of fire, so to speak. First time they've gone into battle. That's not unusual. We've done that in every war, and Americans perform very well. Nevertheless, of all the training we give them, which is probably the best in the world, it's still impossible to replicate combat, and they have to learn about combat just through doing it. And it's a sort of chilling thing the first few moments when you discover that somebody else on this planet is trying to kill you. But they can be gotten used to with time and we hope that our training will make their reactions through this period just automatic, just so that they don't have a problem until they get used to this unusual environment that they're now in.
You have commanded men in battle extensively over your career, though perhaps never this many. In fact, undoubtedly never this many. What do you worry about most in the first 24, 48 hours of this campaign?
You worry about unusual things, things that you didn't anticipate. Also, you worry about these qualms about the first few moments and that people can accommodate very quickly to what they're doing. And you worry about the momentum getting going as you planned it, etc., and that you haven't overlooked anything. And you worry about surprises.
I keep thinking about, I think it was a logistics general in Saudi Arabia at the very beginning of the American buildup in Saudi Arabia who referred to the computer factor in this war. He said all the computer sputs it out every day and then we all conduct the war as if it were one sheet of music. I recall you telling me the first 10 minutes of battle you throw all those plans out the window.
Well, you certainly do in the planning process. We've thrown all our pre-war plans out the window, but bear in mind we've had 5 months to plan this attack, to plan, to coordinate it. This is probably the best planned attack that the United States military has participated in since Normandy.
At the same time, it is so technological, so dependent upon computers, has so many men and so much equipment involved. That must worry you a little, doesn't it?
Of course it worries me, but in the end it's dependent on individual soldiers and sailors and Marines and airmen right there on the ground whose initiative and whose imagination and whose sheer guts is going to compensate for errors that computers make.
Are you, I'm sorry, you were going to say something else.
Well, and that's what Americans do best.
Are you encouraged by the fact that the Iraqi, or should I say how encouraged are you by the fact that the Iraqi forces seem to have been badly attrited, as you say, in the military by all of the bombing over the last 38 days?
Well, of course I find that encouraging, and we're going to find a lot of very dispirited, very upset, and very confused Iraqis. We will also find some pockets, however, that will fight fiercely and that are to be feared, and the things that Tony Cordesman has been describing, some of those will be there, and there's no way, no matter what enveloping and flanking and imaginative tactics, someplace you have to fight straight on.
Just one last question, Admiral, because you've heard a lot of generals be very confident publicly. When you hear them talk like that, do you want to tell them to keep their trap shut, or do you tend to share the view?
I would prefer, of course, that our society let our military keep completely quiet, but we don't live in that kind of world. And they're speaking to a number of audiences. They're not all speaking to you and me. They're speaking to their own people, and they have to put up a confident front, which is, and incidentally, they are confident. We've had a lot of experience thus far that suggests confidence is the right mode vis-a-vis the Iraqis.
Admiral, thank you very much again for coming and joining us this evening. Admiral Crowell, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Colin Powell, of course, the current chairman. Island there, which had been occupied by an Iraqi mechanized group. That is to say, there had been Iraqi tanks on that island. It had been attacked over the several days. It has now been occupied, General Traynor said, by Marines, a reasonable assumption, as the Marines are part of the Marine amphibious operation that has been going up and down the Gulf over the last several days. But there it is, 4 hours since the land war began. It's 8 o'clock in the morning in Baghdad, and the land invasion has begun in the fullest way. An enormous number of men and vast amounts of equipment, as Admiral Crowell has set out, going forward on the land and going forward on the air, trying, as the Secretary of Defense said, to keep the Iraqi defenders guessing constantly as to where the main thrust of the Allied forces coming from. The Egyptians there commanding the Syrians, something people in the Middle East thought that they would never see before. And as Pierre Salinger said, the British and the French forces. The Egyptian forces attacking, so we are told, which at one point several weeks ago people wondered if they would truly do. and the Saudis and the Kuwaitis, of course, and the forces of Qatar and the United Arab Emirates. Saddam Hussein calls it the great mother of battles. As someone said, perhaps it's a little too glib, but it's true. He's in a mother of a corner. Now, here is our coverage. We'll be back tomorrow morning at 10 o'clock Eastern Time with a special, and David Brinkley and his program this week will have as his special guest James Baker. For all of my colleagues here and overseas, my thanks to them. Our thanks to you for joining us. I'm Peter Jennings.
That is now available to us would seem to rule that out. It just happened to be that tonight was the night, just as these reports of this scorched earth policy were really starting to mount.
David Martin at the Pentagon. Wyatt Andrews is at the White House. Wyatt?
Dan, we are learning here at the White House some significant, historically significant details about why it was exactly that the president gave up the relatively risk-free, obviously there were casualties, I say relatively risk-free air war to go to this very potentially bloody ground offensive. And what is emerging here is a picture of a president very driven, not by any of the politics that we've seen swirling around for the last week, but by the recommendation of General Norman Schwarzkopf to go, as David Martin just described, at H hour, 8 p.m. Tonight. What's important about that is that there wasn't anything about the Soviet initiative. Again, as David mentioned, nothing about the torching of Kuwait or any of the reports going out of that. Rather straight military dogma about when Norman Schwarzkopf thought he was ready. And that helps explain why the president, with the Soviet peace plan in his hand last Thursday night, decided to go for the noon deadline of today, because he knew that his commander in the field wanted to go tonight, Saturday night, and he wasn't going to let anything short of an Iraqi withdrawal stand in the way from that. One more significant detail here, Dan, and that is you've heard the president and Marlin Fitzwater for weeks now say that the war is on schedule and all is going to plan. Tonight, a senior administration official says, while that's still pretty much true, he acknowledged that the air war, the length of the air war, has been rather surprising to the White House, that they did not expect the air campaign to take as long as it did. Certainly not 5.5 weeks. They wouldn't give a date of exactly when it was, but they didn't think it would go 5.5 weeks. And that what delayed the progress of the air war was the intensive search for the Scud launchers once it was clear that Saddam's game was to try to get Israel into the war. So once again, Dan, the picture emerging here is that this decision was not driven at all by politics, and that when Iraq failed to live up to the president's ultimatum, it was an all-the-way go with the advice of his military commanders. Dan?
Thanks, Wyatt. A reminder to our viewers that the information on the progress of the ground offensive is very limited. In many cases, is limited for good reasons. Defense Secretary Cheney announced earlier that official Pentagon briefings are being suspended for the time being. News reports from the field are also deliberately non-specific on many details, all of that to protect the lives of U.S. troops operating in the battle zone. There is censorship here in the battle zone, and part of the message from the Defense Secretary tonight was very clearly that the censorship, again, understandably, will get tighter for at least the time being and for the foreseeable future. American soldiers, of course, are anxious in the early stages of the ground war. Anyone would be under their circumstances, but by now, they know the plan. They know where they're supposed to go. The Iraqis, in their defensive stance, have less to go on. They know that they're being attacked, but they don't know exactly how, and they certainly didn't know when it was going to start, and they don't know what the offensive plan as it unfolds, what it calls for. Another important weapon as the ground war begins is the Kiowa helicopter. Bruce Hall shows us one. Bruce?
And one thing that we do know is that the helicopter, the OH-58D, is going with the troops right in the front. And in reality, the OH-58D becomes the eyes of the troops. And with me is Chief Warrant Officer Charles Greeley. Why and how does this helicopter help the troops as they go?
Well, Bruce, the way it helps troops is up here on top we've got an MMS process, or MMS. And it's like a periscope. And what it does is it allows you to be defecated or hidden from the ground like a sand dune or a sand trap. And you can look and see the enemy without being detected. At nighttime, we have a thermal imaging sight system. and it allows you to see during the night, and also during the daytime we have a TV. Along with that, we have a laser that helps guide smart bombs into prime targets.